From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs in the John W. Clootie Center. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for this wonderful lecture. You can see the title on the screen, but I guess I'll read it. Pictures Without Borders, Transnationalism in Illustrated Books of the 15th and 16th Century from the Lessing Rosenwald Collection. And our speaker is Ilaria Andreoli. She will be introduced more formally in a minute. Let me just say a word about the Clootie Center. Clootie Center was established in 2000 with a major donation from John W. Clootie with two purposes. One, to make it possible for senior scholars to come into informal conversations with members of Congress. Doesn't always happen, but occasionally it does and can be quite wonderful. But especially at the junior level, to make it possible for promising young scholars, and the initial focus was on postdoctoral scholars, to use the library's collections to really do their research, to mine the collections, and to help them get over the early humps in the profession. As part of our programs, then, we also offer lectures such as this one by senior scholars, and this particular one by one of our rising, promising junior fellows. If you'd like to know more about them, you can pick up a brochure, you can sign up for email notification, and we'll come knock on your door and say, hey, there's something interesting happening. This event will be recorded, and if you have comments or you have questions later on, you'll probably be picked up by the camera, so just be aware of that. Without further ado, though, I do want to introduce you to my colleague, Dan DeSimone, who will actually be doing the introduction. Dan is the curator of the Rosenwald Collection in the Rare Books and Special Collections Division of the Library of Congress. And I'm not sure Dan has worked on a number of wonderful exhibitions that I've seen here at the Library of the Rare Book Collections, and has been working closely with Ilaria Andreoli on her project. So here to introduce our program really is Dan DeSimone.
Good afternoon. Ilaria Andreoli is a specialist in book illustration, in particular on the circulation of iconographic models in illustrated books during the 15th and 16th centuries. Trained as a historian of early modern art and a book historian, she received a PhD from the universities of Lyon, France, and Venice, Italy in 2006. She's been a fellow at the Gulbenkian Foundation, Lisbon, the French Academy of Rome, Harvard University's Houghton Library, the Cini Foundation in Venice, the Villa Itati in Florence. And now she's a fellow here at the Clootie Center. For 2 years, she was on the faculty and was the coordinator of the History of Text Technologies program at Florida State University, and she is presently a researcher at the National Institute of Art History in Paris, and teaches history and techniques of book illustration at the graduate program in the University of Caen in Normandy. Her most recent book is Exercices Furieux, a compendium of articles which she edited on the illustrations in the numerous editions of Orlando Furioso, printed between the 16th and the 19th century. Now, like most Clootie scholars, Ilaria came to the Library of Congress with significant experience in her field of study, in her case, Renaissance book illustration. This subject is of keen interest and importance to us in the Rare Book Division because one of our great strengths is our collections of illustrated books in the Lessing Rosenwald Collection. These books document the development of the graphic arts printed in all the major centers of book production in Western Europe from the late medieval period to about 1960. Our collection is particularly strong in 15th century books illustrated with the woodcut and printed in Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, Paris, Lyon, Antwerp, Haarlem, Delft, Gouda, Basel, Augsburg, Ulm, Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Seville. And I list all those cities because this discussion today is about transnationalism, and it's important that we understand the movement of image and text throughout Europe during this period. And I think it was the scope of our collections that brought Ilaria to the library, and with her she brought a very keen and clear understanding of how to go about studying this collection, and it was her method that I'd like to just spend 1 minute to talk about. As the curator, I witnessed the procession of book trucks that were delivered to Ilaria's desk in the reading room on a daily basis. While these deliveries were great for our user statistics, they more importantly revealed the progress of her developing thesis. She began with the big categories, the 8 editions of the Speculum Humanae, printed in German, Italian, French, and Dutch, then the 9 editions of the Ars Moriendi that were similarly published throughout Europe's great cities. Then she moved on to the 27 editions of Aesop, the 17 editions of various works by Boccaccio, Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools. It was printed in Europe in 8 different editions. At a certain point, Ilaria's book trucks revealed a change in strategy. She started over, in a sense, looking at the same books, but instead of concentrating on all the editions of an individual title, she began to examine various titles printed during the same time period, no matter which city they originated from. This change of strategy suggested to me that Ilaria was focusing her attention on the development of style in different cities during a given period. Toward the end of her research, Ilaria's book truck revealed the titles she'd be focusing on in her presentation today. It's time now to sit back and witness the fruits of Ilaria's research and the results of her methodical study. I introduce to you Ilaria Andreoli.
Thank you, Dan, for these kind words, and thank you, Caroline. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, thank you very much to be here today. And it is a great pleasure for me to present here at the Library of... Thank you, Dan, for these kind words, and thank you, Caroline. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, thank you very much to be here today. And it is a great pleasure for me to present here at the Library of Congress some aspects of the research that I conduct during this academic year, thanks to a fellowship from the Clootie Foundation. And I want, first of all, to thank the Clootie Center wholeheartedly for having me made my 10 months in Washington so profitable and in many ways charming. My gratitude also goes to the personnel in the Rare Book Department who, as we saw, who tirelessly and gracefully answered my innumerable requests for book and information. The purpose of Pictures Without Borders is to aim at a global history of the circulation of images during the Renaissance period that focuses on the most characteristic artifacts of the century and half between 1450 and 1600. The hand-pressed book that appeared around 1450, and on the thousands of mechanically produced images that is disseminated through Europe. To achieve the ambitious goal of globally embracing the circulation of printed images, it was invaluable for me to be able to work year-round in the Lessing Rosenwald Collection that was expressly conceived from a transnational point of view. Its aim being to unite the best illustrated books and prints regardless of their origin. In that sense, the collection is very different from the European public repositories of ancient books, such as the British Library of the Bibliothèque Nationale, that grew without a specific focus on illustration, or the great private collection of illustrated books that usually emphasize a particular origin or period. One can quote here the collection of Italian illustrated books amassed by Victor Massenat, Prince of Essling, the majority of which is now in the Fondazione Cini in Venice, and which served as a basis for his classical study of Italian Renaissance illustration. Studying the Rosenwald Collection thus added considerably to my knowledge of illustrated book collecting in the late 19th and early 20th century, and allowed me to situate Rosenwald in a gallery of portraits that includes Fairfax Murray, Horace de Landau, Henry Huntington, the Pierpont Morgan, Tamara de Marinis, or Philip Hofer. Let me remind you briefly some essential stages in the formation of the largest single gathering of rare books at the Library of Congress, and one of the finest collection of books formed by any individual. When he began to collect in the late 20s, Lessing Rosenwald was in his mid-30s, managing the Philadelphia branch of Sears Roebuck, the company his father Julius Rosenwald had made into both an American institution and a powerful force in retail marketing. For about a year, at the very beginning of his collecting career, Lessing Rosenwald was exclusively a print collector, at a very favorable time to buy prints. But soon, in the late 20s, he began seriously to buy from the flamboyant Philadelphia rare book dealer A.S.W. Rosenbach. Rosie, Doc, the Doc, or the Doctor, as he variously styled, who is in these decades sold books to a galaxy of major American book collectors: Henry Clay Folger, Arthur Henry Houghton, the Pierpont Morgan's father and son, and their formidable librarian Belle de Costa Green, and many others. One of his most famous exploits was taking to America the original manuscript of Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures Underground. He will actually buy it twice in less than 20 years, as lot number 319 of the 1928 London Sotheby's auction, surrounded by an incredible tension and excitement. The Rosenberg Connection was unquestionably the sine qua non for launching Rosenwald as a book collector by convincing him that he should make his collection comprehensive through including in his scope not only woodcut prints, but also the masterpieces of the woodcut art in the form of book illustration. Shortly after this, Lessing Rosenwald came down with, in the words of Rosenbach's biographer, a most virulent case of bibliomania. On the last day of 1929, in the middle of the stock market crash, he committed himself to spending almost $300,000 in Rosenbach's shop for a beautiful group of illustrated incunables. Rosenwald trusted the doctor not only as a mentor, a tempter, and a super salesman, but most importantly, as a friend. Their close relationship ended only with Rosenbach's death in 1952. Rosenwald gave the doctor the major credit for the high quality of many of the rarest books in his collection. In the condition of one of the firm's books failed to meet Rosenbach's standards for the collection, he would refuse to sell it, saying a better copy will come along. By the time of the 1933 gift to the Library of Congress, the shape of the collection had basically been set. Its central focus is illustrated book, strongest in 15th and 16th centuries, 18th century French books, William Blake, William Morris Kelmscott Press, and 20th century lived artists, but having representative holdings of illustrated Western printed books from all centuries from the 15th century on, supported by block books and a small but choice group of 12 to 16th century illuminated manuscripts. To provide the underpinnings for his illustrated books, Rosenwald turned his attention in that period to the monumentos of early printing for the years before illustration first were used in printed books. In the 1952, the New York rare book dealer H.P. Krauss phoned Rosenwald to say that he had a book that cried out to be in his collection, a magnificent 2-volume manuscript Bible, generally known as the Giant Bible of Men's, which in many people's eyes is the greatest single book in the Rosenwald collection. It went on display at the Library of Congress on the 4th of April, 1952, the 15th anniversary of the day the scribe first set pen to the first vellum page, and one of the 2 volumes has been on permanent display even since, across from the library's copy of the Great Bible, to which it is important links. Though Rosenwald used Rosenbach as his principal, Rosenbach, who had inherited the mantle of George D. Smith, the rare book dealer who so completely dominated the American rare book market until his death, and who played such a major role in the formation of the collection of Henry Huntington and other major collectors, he differed markedly from Smith's typical clients, as he constantly strove to define and confine and to focus on quality rather than on full representation. He brought to his collecting an independent taste based on an eye for artistic quality developed from years of looking at prints, despite the handicap of being virtually blind in one eye as a result of a childhood accident, and on advice of specialists such as Rosenbach himself, Paul Sachs, co-director of the Fogg Museum in Harvard, Elizabeth Mongan, and his first curator, and Frederick Goff, chief of the Rare Book Division of the Library of Congress from 1945 to 1972, who became soon real good friends. Housed at his private gallery and library, Halberthorpe, in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, during his lifetime, at Mr. Rosenwald's death in 1979, the collection had grown to more than 40,000 prints and 2,600 separate editions in a substantially larger number of physical volumes. Slightly fewer than 600 are in Cunabala, with an additional fine collection of 7,000 books of supporting reference. This is the Halberthorpe. After a first donation in 1933, the entire book collection was delivered to the Library of Congress in 1980, and the print collection to the National Gallery, essentially creating an important new department. Although there was a gift divided by intention between 2 national institutions, Rosenwald itself saw the prints and printed books as a part of a unified collection, formed according to his developing tastes. Beyond the catalog of the gift, a magnificent exhibition in 2004, A Heavenly Craft, a woodcut in early printed books, curated by Daniel, opened the public the wonders of Rosenwald's 15th and 16th century illustrated books, and was a major inspiration for my own work. Mr. Rosenwald wanted his book used. Never has been a collector with greater concern for the public appreciations of his collection. In an article about an exhibition of his books at the library in 1945, Lessing Rosenwald said, "It is hoped that the pleasure I have derived might now be enjoyed by the many, and that the small amount of knowledge I have acquired might be greatly magnified by students better equipped to unearth the fascinating secrets not yet disclosed. I indulge in the thought that my Kluge Fellowship and this lecture give me the possibility to pay him tribute, after having daily enjoyed for almost a year the pleasure that he derived from his collecting." So now on to the fascinating secret of pictures without borders. Avoiding technicalities, I choose to present a small selection of 8 vignettes about specific cases that will help me highlight the variety of issues that one has to face when choosing the vantage point of transnationalism. My first example, we have to do with war and death. When Roberto Valturio's military treatise about war engineers, the Remedy Tari, was completed around 1460, the patron who commissioned it, Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, ruler of Rimini, sent a few manuscript copies to fellow European sovereigns, such as the King of France, Louis XI, Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, Lorenzo de' Medici, ruler of the Florentine Republic, even to the Sultan Mohammed II. All in all, 2,200 copies survive, a considerable figure for a late medieval manuscript. The Rosenwald Collection is fortunate enough to possess 2 of them, produced in North Italy during the 3rd quarter of the 15th century. This is one. One of them, this one, this war machine. So one of them contains a beautiful surprise, a drawing with no connection to the subject matter of the text. Though it is drawn as an inserted bifolio, whose conjugate leaf contains an illustration from the normal sequence. So this is the bifolio. This is the other side of the sheet. The style of the figures and of the details are clearly reminiscent of Andrea Mantegna, which places the drawing in the context of Northeast Italy, where Mantegna's influence was most strongly felt from around 1460 to his death in 1506. The majority of Valturio manuscripts also came from this area, and there is specific evidence to connect this manuscript with the Veneto. The author of the drawing may be either a book illuminator, though certainly not the same as the main illustrator of the manuscript, a painter, or an engraver. Some artists from this region were all 3. Anyway, stylistic analysis allows dating this manuscript between 1470 and 1490. Around the same time, in 1472, the book appeared in print in his Latin edition published in Verona, which was followed in 1483, always in Verona, by an Italian version. So this is a printed edition, and you can see it re-imply the same models for the woodcuts. The elegant woodcut illustration derived from the drawings in the manuscript copies, probably the work of the architect, medallist, and miniaturist Matteo de Pasti. If they are more rigorous in their rendition of perspective, space, and human anatomy, their importance mostly lay in the fact that the pictures of the war engines now achieved a wide distribution through the print medium, crossing the borders of the courtly world to enter the Italian European book market. It is through the Italian edition, for example, that Leonardo da Vinci was acquainted with Valturio and drew inspiration from it for some of his drawings of military technology. As the second illustrated book to be printed in Italy, the Remedy Tari has characteristics of transnational work. The use of signature marks to aid in the assembly of the book is still lacking. There is no pagination, and the woodcuts were printed separately from the text. As in many books from the first decades of the printing, a role was still envisioned for the miniaturists and rubricators who had long been employed in the production of manuscripts. Initial letters, like here, and headings were not printed but were meant to be added by hand. On the pages shown here, we see some of the capital letters have been painted in red and blue, like, oops, here and here. Larger illuminated initial mark major division within the book. From the 1483 edition on, though, the visual space is totally determined by the demand of typography. Like in this edition on 1483. So the images are more compact in the pages. 50 years after their first publication, the Veronese woodcuts received a new lease of life and crossed new borders when the famous Parisian printer Christian Vechel published a new edition of the Latin text in 1532, as well as an edition of the military Latin writer Vegetius, prepared by the great French humanist Guillaume Boudet, republished in 1534 and 1535. The Parisian edition added new illustration to the original one, reinterpreted in the classical style of the French Renaissance. Also, they provide a totally different context for them, presenting Valturio as a classical author, not a military engineer. In fact, the two Vechel editions of Valturio and Vegetius are often bound together. Pictures thus traveled from Rimini to Verona and Paris, and from the world of courts and humanist circles to the European Republic of Letters. The Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, provides an opposite example of border crossing from manuscript illustration, this time toward three other techniques: Italian engraving, block book, where text and images are carved in the same block of wood, and wood blocks in book, printed in movable type. Much more than an elite humanist text of Valturio, it testifies to a wide circulation beyond the learned public. I remind you that the Ars Moriendi is a Latin text that offers advice on how to die well, according to a Christian precepts. Composed in its original form in 1415 by an anonymous Dominican friar, probably at the request of the Council of Constance, it was written within the historical context of the effects of the macabre horrors of the Black Death 60 years earlier, and consequent social upheavals of the 15th century. Very popular, it was translated into most West European languages. The long version survived in about 300 manuscript versions, only one illustrated. In its short version, mostly an adaptation of the second chapter of the long version, it survives in 6 manuscripts, one of which was identified by Fritz Sachs of the common source for a series of engraving by the master E.S., known in many copies by other engravers. So this is the series of the master, 2 examples of the sheets of the master E.S. And over 20 extant block book illustrated edition, they use 13 different sets of blocks for 11 woodcut pictures and instructive images which could be easily explained and memorized. The first 10 woodcuts are divided in 5 pairs, with each set showing a picture of the devil presenting one of the 5 temptations, and the second picture showing the proper remedy for that temptation. The last woodcut, so this is, for example, the temptation of avaricious, and this is the remedy. And the last woodcuts show the dying man, presumably having successfully navigated the maze of temptation, being accepted into heaven, and the devils going back to hell in confusion. Studies of the watermarks of the block books at the British Museum in the 1960s confirmed that none of them predated the 1460s. So Master E.S. engravings are the earliest printed version dating from around 1450. Ars Moriendi was also among the first books printed in movable type, illustrated with wood blocks that reproduced the same manuscript models, and was widely circulated before 1500, in particular in Germany. So we have very different examples in the Rosenwald Collection. These two are Germans, and you can see how the copies are often in a mirror form. And this is a very tiny edition, always German. And this is a French edition of the same text with copies of the same iconography. We have an exceptional number of about 70 incunabula editions in a variety of languages, from Catalan to Dutch, the earliest from about 1474 from Cologne. In the Rosenwald Collection alone, there are 3 German block book editions and 6 incunabula, 2 printed in Leipzig, 1 in Delft, 2 in Paris. This is the Antoine Dera edition, and another one by Guy Marchand, and 1 with beautiful woodcuts in Florence. So you can see the iconography is still the same one. We will switch now to the case in which text and images did not depend on a manuscript source, but were conceived from the start as a part of the integrated visual space of a printed book. Text here is inconceivable without its illustration, or rather its illustration is a textual nature. The Ship of Fools, in German Das Narrenschiff ad Narragonium, in Latin Stultifera Navis, is a book of satire critical of the current state of the Church by the theologian and humanist Sebastian Brandt, originally published in German in Basel in 1494. Its title was inspired by a pun on the Latin word navis, which means boat, but also the nave of a church. Each of the 112 brief satires was illustrated with a woodcut, including the first commissioned work by the young Albrecht Dürer, that represents between 1 and 2/3 of the total. So this is some examples of the Dürer woodcuts, or woodcuts from the Dürer's drawings. The work immediately became extremely popular, with 6 authorized and 7 pirated editions published before 1521. So this, for example, is an unauthorized reprint. It's the Strasbourg. This is, it was even the subject of sermons published in Strasbourg in 1511 by a popular Dominican preacher, Johann Geiler, that reproduced the original woodcuts. The text was soon translated into Latin, French, Flemish, English, and the woodcuts copied more or less skillfully for almost a century. So this is a French edition. This is an English edition. And this is a Flemish one.